Good day. Today is Tuesday, 14th January 2025, and we've had some more comments this morning from President-elect Donald Trump about his forthcoming meeting with President Putin. He has in fact confirmed that he wants this meeting to take place as soon as possible. This is how Reuters reports Trump's words. He says that he wants to meet President Putin very quickly after he takes office next week. He does not provide a timeline for the meeting, which would be the first between the leaders of the two countries since February 2022. And when asked about his strategy to end the war, Trump said, well, there's only one strategy, and it's up to Putin. And I can't imagine he's too thrilled about the way it's gone, because it hasn't gone exactly well for him either. And I know he wants to meet, and I'm going to meet very quickly. I would have done it sooner, but you have to get into office for some of the things. You have to be there. So that's Trump's words. He wants to meet with Putin, and he wants to meet with Putin as soon as possible. And importantly, when asked about how does the war end, Trump says it's up to Putin. Now, he does also say that things have not turned out exactly as Putin would have wanted. He's not thrilled by the direction, the way events went. And up to a point, that's true. Back in February and March 2022, as has now become absolutely clear, now that we have the full story of the negotiations in Belarus and in Istanbul in our hands, we can say that clearly Putin's objective at that time was not a prolonged war, but rather he wanted a negotiated settlement with Ukraine as soon as possible. He wanted Ukraine to agree that it should not join NATO. He wanted Ukraine to accept that it would adopt a neutral status. He wanted certain changes to the way in which Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian political system was organized. He wanted protections for Russian speakers and ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. And at that time, he wanted to secure the position of the two republics of the Donbass. And he wasn't insisting, this was in March 2022, he wasn't insisting at that time that Ukraine recognize those states or entities as they then were as independent states, which is what the Russians had recognized them as. But he did want the Ukrainians to accept de facto that these states were indeed self-governing. And lastly, Putin was also looking to agree security guarantees with Ukraine. Crucially, Russia was to be a key guarantor, and as part of those guarantees, Russia would have an effective veto over the deployment of foreign troops and foreign bases on Ukrainian territory. So those were Putin's objectives at that time. Putin was not looking for a long war. He was looking for a quick and final end to the Ukrainian crisis, securing Russia's border through a diplomatic settlement. His launch of the special military operation was intended to be a show of force, a show of will, one which he hoped the Ukrainians would understand and which would lead them to shift from their previous intransigent position and come to terms in a way that the Russians found unacceptable. And of course, it did not turn out that way. Putin instead found that the Ukrainians, persuaded to do so by the West, walked away from the Istanbul Agreement, Putin then found that Russia was indeed caught up in a long war, something he had not sought or wanted. And of course, he also found that Russia was under extraordinary economic attack by the West through the multiplicity of sanctions imposed upon it, and also that there was a concerted attempt by the Western powers to isolate Russia from the West and to exclude it permanently from Europe. So I can say with confidence that Trump is right. These were not things that Putin wanted. In February, March 2022, he would have been deeply unhappy if on the day when he ordered his special military operation, he had known that all of this would be what took place. But that's not the same as saying that that unhappiness, that concern about these events would have dissuaded Putin from launching the special military operation. As Putin himself has said many times, as indeed he was saying at that very time, he felt that he had no alternative to do so, that holding back and doing nothing would eventually have resulted in Ukraine joining NATO and American bases being established in Ukraine, that was, as far as Putin was concerned, and in this he is joined by most Russians, an existential threat. He was also concerned that Ukraine was talking about military solutions to the problems of Donbass and indeed Crimea as well. And again, he expressed at the time concerns about that too. So quite probably, if Putin had had a ability to foresee everything that would happen, nonetheless, he would have started the military operation anyway, even though the outcome that it led to would not have been the one he wanted. And on that score, I think that I would, if I was advising Trump, make the point to him that what Putin wanted in February and March 2022 may not be the same as what Putin wants today in February 2025, when he is visibly winning the war. And I say that because though Putin has had to do all kinds of things which in February and March 2022 he did not expect that he would need to do, he's had to ramp up military production, increase spending on military matters. He's had to enlarge the armed forces. He's had to recruit hundreds of thousands of men to the armed forces. And he has had to fight a bitter war in which many Russians have died. Nonetheless, he is now, as he must feel, in a position of enormous advantage. His forces are advancing in eastern Ukraine. Donbass is now within sight of being completely cleared of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have suffered tremendous losses. The Russians are probably anticipating, before long, an advance to the Dnieper River. And as for Russia's domestic position, its economy has shown astonishing resilience, one which will continue. I've discussed this in many programs. Its relationships with third countries outside the West have turned out to be far more enduring and resilient than anyone in February 2022 might have expected, including, by the way, Putin himself. And overall, Putin finds himself in February 2025 in a far stronger position than perhaps he would have expected in February 2022, when he launched the special military operation. Had he known that his attempts at a negotiated solution in the spring of 2022 would fail, and had he also known that the West would step up its economic war and would step up its military supplies to Ukraine. So today's Putin is coming to the negotiations with a bounce in his step, with confidence that the war is being won. And again, judging from these words, I am not sure whether Trump yet fully understands that. I say this because looking at Trump's words, he appears to accept still much of the narrative that has been circulated in the West about how the Russian economy is cracking under the stress of the war, that the Russians have suffered enormous losses on the battlefield. And my own view is that this narrative is wrong in fundamental ways. And by the way, and importantly, one of the most important things about establishing a dialogue between the Americans and the Russians is that the Russians will now have an opportunity to explain that fact to the Americans, to Trump himself. And, well, in my experience in negotiations, it's sometimes essential to bring the parties together, not just so that they can better understand each other, but so that they can also understand how the other side perceives its position, and whether that side, the other side, sees its position as weak or strong, which of course brings you back to a better understanding of how strong or weak your own position is. Now, I'm confident that when Trump does meet Putin over the next few weeks, he will be meeting the Putin that I've described, a Putin with a bounce in his step, a Putin who is confident that events are moving in his direction, and that Trump will probably come away from that meeting with a better understanding of that fact than he has now. So that's why a meeting of this kind is important. Now, I think at this point it might be a good thing if I do, in fact, briefly, again, touch on the current military situation on the battlefronts. Because events, of course, continue to move, and they are moving now extremely fast, and faster than they have done at any point since the serious fighting in Ukraine began in May 2022. The first thing to say is that though there were some scattered suggestions yesterday that Chasiv Yar had fallen, I think we got a clearer picture of the situation in Chasiv Yar this morning. Fighting there does still continue. There is still continued fighting in Chasiv Yar, but the Russians do appear to have captured the refractory factory in the industrial zone. The Ukrainians themselves are saying that the Russians have in fact captured the entire industrial zone, and that overall the situation in Chasiv Yar is such as one must conclude that the battle for that town now really is coming to an end. Comments from Ukrainian sources about the battle for Chasiv Yar are becoming increasingly depressed. There's been a report about this, by the way, on TASS. The source is Igor Kimakovsky, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government. He said in a live broadcast on Channel 1 television in Russia, the Ukrainian troops, have left the refractory plant after quite serious resistance. The assault operations by our units have been effective, and now the enemy has been pushed back to the private residential area slightly south of the plant and slightly west of it to the private residential sector. Battles are now raging outside the plant, and our forces are primarily mopping up the area of multi-story buildings, following which the town's full liberation can be considered achieved. The advance by our forces in Chasiv Yar should be viewed together with our successes in Toretsk. The enemy understands well that after we liberate Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, and they are still putting up some resistance at the coal mine, he's talking about Toretsk now, we will actually mop up quite a large urban agglomeration near Konstantinovka that will create an advantageous bridgehead for further successful operations. So Kimakovsky is actually giving us a lot of information. He says that the Russians have captured the industrial zone. They're still fighting underway in Chasiv Yar, but these are mopping up operations. He says that the entirety of Toretsk is under Russian control, except that there is still a Ukrainian presence in a coal mine. That would be the Toretsk coal mine, located actually to the northeast of Toretsk. It's just outside the urban area of Toretsk. The Russians, however, clearly expect that they will clear up that mine, that they will bring the mine fully under Russian control within the next couple of days. And then perhaps sometime next week, maybe a bit later, both Chasiv Yar and Toretsk will be completely under Russian control. And the Russians will at that point be in a position, as Kimakovsky says, to capture large numbers of villages and smaller urban locations immediately to the north of and west of these two towns. And that will put them in a very strong position to begin storming first Konstantinovka and then ultimately preparing for the last big battle in Donbass, the battle for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Now, elsewhere, we had confirmation yesterday that the Russians have cut the road, physically cut the road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. It seems as if the Russians are maintaining their presence on that road. But yesterday, we got confirmation also that the Russians have cut the road, physically cut the road between Pokrovsk and Dnipro, and we have information about this again from TASS. A road passing through the settlement of Mezhevaya, one of two highways leading to Dnipro from Pokrovsk, has been cut off by the Russian armed forces, a source in the security services told TASS. The enemy logistics through Dnipro is currently disrupted. The highway towards Mezhevaya has been cut. This is one of the two major roads leading to the adjacent region. The other road, the Pokrovsk-Pavlograd road, is also under Russian control. Now, that is complicated. I'm not quite sure what places this source is referring to. There are indeed two roads leading towards the Dnieper from western Pokrovsk. This source suggests that both of these roads have been cut by the Russians in some way. I'm not quite sure how that is possible, but what I would say is that we've been getting reports, again, over the course of the last 24 hours, that the Russians have established themselves in an area between the villages of Kotlino and Udachnye. This is the road, I think, that the sources specifically referring to, the village of Mezhova, appears to lie directly on this road. But anyway, the Russians have established themselves on that road already. There is a road further to the north, the E50 road. I cannot imagine that the Russians have yet reached it. But perhaps what the source is talking about is that the Russians have established drone and fire control over this road as well. Possibly. Anyway, the point is that the communications to Pokrovsk, one by one, are being snipped off. And that is very much what the Russians do. And we're likely to see more of it happen over the next couple of days. So the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka is cut. One of the roads from Pokrovsk to Dnipro has been cut. The Russians probably have drone and fire control over another road. That leaves just one road left, the road to Pokrovsk from the north. But of course, if the Russians cross the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka road, they would soon be in a position to cut that road too. Now, that would not establish a cauldron in Pokrovsk. I think that the word cauldron, I'm coming round to the view, has been overused in this war. The Russian objective is not, when attacking towns, to establish cauldrons around them. It is to cut the major supply lines, making sustained defense of the town impossible. That forces the Ukrainians to retreat, often across the fields, where the Russians can hunt them in the fields while taking control of the town with far less resistance. And that is what happened in Selidovo, Novogrodivka, Kurahovo, and it looks like it's what's coming also for Pokrovsk. Just saying. So anyway, that's one battle. It looks as if there's been confirmation that the Russians have captured significant positions inside Velikaya Novosilka. There's apparently intense fighting going on within that small town. It looks as if that town also is being stormed. There is again an exit for the Ukrainians who are in that town through the fields and dirt tracks to the north. No doubt at some point they will try and flee. I suspect that the collapse of Velikaya Novosilka could happen at any moment. We will suddenly learn that resistance has collapsed, and we will learn that the Russians are in full control of the place. And of course, there's lots of fighting going on in many other places. I'm not going to go into the details, but the trajectory in every one of these places is the same. The Russians continue to advance, as I discussed in my program yesterday. They've now got a powerful bridgehead north of Kupiansk, on the west bank of the Oskol River. They have a powerful bridgehead west of the Zherebets River, threatening Liman. They are continuing operations in Kursk region, gradually tightening the noose around Suja. There was an article, I think, in the New York Times, in which a Ukrainian soldier, spoke about how difficult the situation in Suja was. And we had a rather vivid description of the main road to Suja being littered with the wreckage of tanks and other armoured vehicles and soft-skinned vehicles. Overwhelmingly, of course, Ukrainian, which have been destroyed by the Russians, even as the Ukrainians desperately try to reinforce their positions in Suja, which has now become a totemic town that it looks as if, for prestige reasons, the Ukrainians cannot retreat from. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, over the course of last night, the Ukrainians launched what is being described as their biggest drone and missile attack on Russia, up to, throughout the entire period of the conflict. And they sent drones to the town of Engels in the northern Caucasus, trying to strike the industrial buildings that provide support to the giant air base that is located there. They sent drones to strike at Kazan again. Quite what they're hoping to achieve in Kazan is not clear, but as I've discussed on previous occasions, Kazan is an important center of the Russian military-industrial complex. And it seems as if they launched another attack, this time with both drones and missiles, at an important chemical works in Bryansk region. And of course, the missiles that they used were ATACMS missiles. Now, we have this information from the regional governor. We don't have the details of the attack. As of the time of making of this program, the Russian Defense Ministry has not provided us with a detailed account of this strike. But it seems as if the chemical factory was not damaged. There are reports that every one of the ATACMS missiles that was launched against this factory was shot down. And it looks as if most of the drones that were launched were also shot down or jammed, and anyway failed to do the damage that they were expected to do. The Russian Defense Ministry will no doubt give us a more detailed account of what happened, not just in Bryansk, but across the entirety of Russia later today, or perhaps tomorrow. Now, the fact that this huge attack, or by Ukrainian standards, is a huge attack has taken place, has produced the usual flurry of claims and headlines, and, that the Ukrainians have been able to attack various industrial facilities across Russia and things of that kind. And as I said, there does seem to have been some damage done to a fuel supplying facility in Engels. But none of this should obscure the actual truth, which very, very few people seem to be able to grasp. These are pinprick attacks. They have achieved nothing of significance in altering the direction of the war. The Russians have absorbed all of these blows. It's like going after a bear with a pea shooter. It can sting the bear, but it can't significantly wound him. And this is true of every one of the attacks that we have seen. As for the ATACMS attack on the chemical works in Bryansk, there's two things to say. Well, there's three things to say. Firstly, like every one of these attacks, it could not have taken place without the direct involvement and participation of American personnel. Putin has said so, the Russians have said so, no one has contradicted him about this. In fact, it has been acknowledged as true by articles in the mainstream media in the West. So the United States was involved in this planning. The attack on the chemical works, if the ATACMS missiles were intended to be used to attack the chemicals works, and I still haven't got a complete picture of the Bryansk strike, but if that is indeed what was planned, it was planned to use the missiles, the ATACMS missiles, to strike at the chemical works, then I would say that this is an outrageous act probably bordering on and perhaps an actual war crime. Because, of course, a chemical works, by definition contains chemicals. If there'd been a serious chemical leakage as a result of a missile strike on the works, then there would have been very significant consequences. Probably many people would have been injured, some of them would have died, there would have been contamination, all kinds of things. I find it incomprehensible. I find it absolutely astonishing that a missile strike on such a plant could be envisaged. I'm not aware, by the way, that this has happened at any point previously in the war, and that American personnel would be involved in planning and conducting such a strike on such a plant inside Russia with the kind of consequences that I've just described. Now, I want to again qualify, I haven't got the full details of the strike, and it may be that the ATACMS missiles were launched at another target in Bryansk, and maybe one shouldn't move too fast and too far ahead. But if the missiles were aimed at the chemical plant, then, as I said, that would have been an astonishing and outrageous thing, and another sign of the incredible addiction of the Biden administration to unceasing and incredibly reckless escalation. Just saying. Put that aside, the big story again here is the total failure of the ATACMS. I don't know how many ATACMS were launched, but all of them apparently were shot down. That's what the Russians are saying, and there seems to be no reason to doubt this. And it looks as if, once again, we've had another strike with the ATACMS missiles, and it has proved unsuccessful. That disastrous, dramatic decision, breaching Russian red lines, that the Biden administration took, probably in April last year, but started to put into effect in November. In November, of authorizing, or at least arranging, missile strikes inside Russia. All it has done is showcase the capabilities of the Russian air defense system and the total inability of the ATACMS to defeat it. It's also, of course, enabled the Russians to showcase the capability of their own Oreshnik missile. This step, which the Biden administration took, which was met with such dread by so many people, including myself, has turned out to be an abject failure and a humiliating debacle. And again, I find it difficult to understand why, given that that is so, the Ukrainians and the Americans and the British persist with it. That, by the way, might bring us back to why it's possible that these missiles were launched against a chemical factory. Because it could be that US, the Biden administration and the Ukrainians, seeing the failure of the ATACMS against hard targets, assumed that a factory of this kind would be less thoroughly defended and that they could strike at it and break through and finally cause some damage which might finally embarrass the Russians. Well, if so, that makes the outrageousness of this attack doubly greater. But anyway, the reality is the attack failed. I don't know how many more ATACMS missiles are left. I'm guessing perhaps a dozen now. But of course, I don't know how many missiles we used in this particular attack. Again, this story has been a story of complete failure. And if we're looking at the drone attacks across Russia that accompanied this missile strike in Bryansk region, it seems again that only insignificant damage was done. I've seen one report that the damage to the facility in Engels was not caused by the drone actually striking the target, but debris from a shot down drone falling on the target. But that's just a report. It's not official, and I'm not sure whether it's true. So anyway, the story again, to repeat, remains that the Russians are advancing across Ukraine. The pace of their advance is rapidly, steadily increasing. Toretsk has to all intents and purposes fallen. Chasiv Yar is about to do so. Velikaya Novosilka is about to do so. The Ukrainians are being pounded and are taking massive losses, and the Ukrainians are being pushed back everywhere and are suffering incredibly heavy losses, even as they try unsuccessfully to stem the Russian advance. Meanwhile, there is some talk, as I understand it, in Ukraine that the Ukrainians are going to change the practice of their troop deployments. There are complaints in Ukraine that the mobilization plan for 2024, the one that was announced in April, the one in which the recruitment age was lowered from 27 to 25, that it fell 75% short. Only 25% of the number of conscripts were, in the end, recruited as compared to what Ukraine expected it would be able to recruit. But the story is that from now on, Ukraine is going to change its practice. Instead of training the conscripts in new brigades, and then when the brigades are ready, sending them to the battlefronts, the conscripts are going to be sent to reinforce, to make up the losses in the existing brigades, which have been left short of men because they're not getting the necessary reinforcements. In other words, Ukraine is going to give up the practice of trying to create new brigades based on newly mobilized manpower. And some people, like the Ukrainian commentator Yuri Butusev, are applauding this and are saying that this is something that is finally being done, but which needed to be done, and that it is a good decision. I think that there is, again, a lot of wishful thinking and misunderstanding about this. First of all, I think that the reason why new conscripts were being sent to new brigades was not because Zelensky wanted to show that he had lots and lots of additional brigades being built up and he wanted to make his army appear bigger than it was. It is because his Western backers have been busy training Ukrainian troops, and they have wanted to train them in complete brigades. The French have been training too. I believe the British have also been training some, the Germans also. So it has been easier and perhaps more prestigious for them to train entire brigades rather than individual Ukrainian soldiers who are then fed directly into the battlefront. Secondly, when the new brigades are indeed created, the usual practice actually has been almost immediately to break them up and to feed the newly trained troops directly into the existing brigades It is a myth that the existing brigades are not getting new recruits. They regularly are, and they regularly complain about how inadequately trained these new recruits turn out to be and how deeply demotivated they are. And, well, one way or the other, the basic problem continues to be the fact that Ukraine, however much it tries, cannot make up for existing losses, whether through setting up new brigades or by sending men directly to the battlefields. The losses are too high because the Russians are too strong. And I'm going to suggest that one of the ways in which we could see the difference on the battlefronts is because with the Russians now outnumbering the Ukrainians right across the line of contact, they're able to maneuver and to take risks which they could not do earlier in the war when the forces were either roughly equal or when the Ukrainians held the manpower advantage. And I don't expect that is going to change. Now, I don't believe that when Putin and Trump meet, Putin is going to sit down and he's going to explain all of that to Trump. What he undoubtedly will tell Trump is that Trump is getting completely wrong figures about Russian losses. The Russians have already said this. They have said that the numbers that the Pentagon and others are quoting, and which Trump himself has quoted for Russian losses, come from Ukrainian estimates, and those estimates are wildly wrong. And by the way, I believe that the Russians are telling the truth about this. And I think that the Russians will also want to convey to Trump the point that additional sanctions are not having the effect. In fact, sanctions altogether are not having the effect on Russia that many people imagine. Now, the Biden administration has just unveiled on Friday, a whole set of new sanctions on the Russian oil industry. The Russian Foreign Ministry has published a strong statement about it, and I will read it. It reads as follows: the decision by the current administration to impose new restrictive measures against Russia's energy sector as a whole, as well as against several major companies, including personal sanctions targeting their leadership and officials from the Russian Ministry of Energy, represents an attempt to inflict damage on the Russian economy at any cost, even at the risk of destabilizing global markets. The move comes in the waning days of President Biden's lackluster tenure in office, against the backdrop of Washington's failed bid to achieve a strategic defeat over Moscow. And despite unprecedented external pressure through sanctions aimed at undermining the Russian economy, our country has not only withstood these efforts, but continues to develop. The outgoing administration's attempts to further tighten restrictions appear to be aimed at creating maximum obstacles for bilateral economic relations, including those involving US businesses, or making such cooperation entirely impossible. Which is an interesting sentence, because it suggests that the Russians think that the main purpose of the Biden administration's sanctions is to make impossible any further potential cooperation between the Russian oil industry and American businesses. I'm not sure that's correct, and it may be that this is not been translated very well. But anyway, never mind, let's press on. In the process, the interests of both the US's European allies, who are being forced to switch to more expensive and less reliable American supplies, and its own citizens are being sacrificed. This is particularly evident as the population suffers from the aftermath of massive wildfires in California. Well, you can throw that in if you wish. I'm not immediately able to see the connection, but perhaps for the Russians it was an irresistible target. Anyway, just saying. Public opinion on rising fuel prices, which mattered before the November presidential election, when Russian petroleum products were being quietly purchased through intermediaries, can now be ignored. And again, that looks like the Russians are saying that the Russians were in fact supplying petroleum products to the US itself, but doing so through intermediaries, that the latest sanctions are intended to block that. And then the article, the statement from the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry, goes on to say, as a result, the incoming president, who cannot revoke these sanctions without congressional approval, I understand that is what the Biden administration is saying. As I discussed previously, when I discussed the sanctions themselves, I am not actually sure that is true. And by the way, I understand that another statement from the current administration is saying that it will be up to Trump to decide when and if existing sanctions on Russia are relaxed, which I think is correct. Anyway, as a result, the incoming president, who cannot revoke these sanctions without congressional approval, will inherit a scorched earth policy, both figuratively and literally. Naturally, Washington's hostile actions will not go unanswered and will be taken into account as we shape our foreign economic strategy. Major domestic projects for oil and gas extraction, import substitution, oil field services, and the construction of nuclear power plants in third countries will continue to move forward. Despite the convulsions in the White House and the maneuvers of the anti-Russia lobby in the West, seeking to drag the global energy sector into the US-initiated hybrid war against Russia, our country remains and will continue to be a key and reliable supplier in the global market. So there we are. That's what the Russian Foreign Ministry has said. You can find it all on the Russian Foreign Ministry website. Now, I've been looking at movements in the various markets over the last couple of days since the sanctions announcement was made. One of the things that struck me immediately is that there's been no significant weakening of the ruble since the announcement was made. And in fact, on Friday, directly after the announcement was made, the Russian stock market actually grew. It actually went up. I don't think one should put too much in that, but clearly Russian economic players are not too dismayed by these sanctions. The Chinese government has made very clear that it strongly disapproves of these sanctions, that it thinks it's completely inappropriate for the United States to interfere in the economic relations between third countries. And that's a long-standing position of the Chinese government. I think China will continue to import Russian oil. And I understand that a lot of the oil trade between China and Russia is now being conducted on Chinese tankers. Just saying. The Indian oil industry, apparently they've been issuing further statements themselves. They say that they do not expect any supply disruptions from the Russians until March, that all the contracts that have been made will be honoured, that the tankers have already been filled with fuel, that they'll all be arriving until March, so that for the next couple of weeks, India will not be affected by the latest sanctions. Interestingly, they also say that beyond March, they expect the Russians to sort out the problems, any problems that have been caused, and to move the process forward. And I expect that they will. Now, there was an interesting article about all of this in oilprice.com. This is a journal of the industry. And, well, they made some fairly interesting points about the overall state of the so-called shadow fleet. They made the same point that I've made many times, that the shadow fleet is only called a shadow fleet because basically it is not insured in London. Far from all of the so-called shadow fleet is affected by these sanctions. At most, 40% of the tankers are. And as I've said, in this kind of situation, the Russians are always able to adjust things. They can buy more ships can reflag. There's always abilities to change names. Oilprice.com in this article mentions that very fact. So you can just rename ships, you can do all sorts of things. It's not actually so difficult to shuttle ships around. And I think here a very important point needs to be understood. The fact that you sanction a ship doesn't mean that the ship disappears or stops sailing, or that it can't find crews or do any of those things. It means that the ship cannot operate within the framework of the Western trading system. So its owner cannot obtain insurance from the ship. It can't set up banking facilities to operate the ship. It can't, for example, pay the crew of the ship from an account in a Western bank. The owner may find that the ship can't dock in some ports and can't get repairs and maintenance in some ports, some ports also. But the ship can still sail. It can still sail from Russia to China, for example, and it can do so mostly along friendly coastlines. Just saying. Ships can also sail from Russia to India. And of course, the Chinese and the Indians can also load oil on their own ships. They're not sanctioned. So all of this, it's a misunderstanding that these sanctions can have quite the effect that people say. I've seen the sanctions referred to as crippling, but they are going to fall far short of crippling anything. Just saying. So one way or the other, the ships will continue to sail. Maybe not always the same ships. Ships, as I said, move around unless there is a sustained attempt to try and close down shipping lanes, to seize ships on the high seas. And that is a very problematic and difficult thing to do. I actually read an interesting article recently on this very point, discussing what might happen to sanctioned shipping. A ship in a country's territorial waters can be seized by the government of that country if it's felt to be violating laws, and that might include sanctions. There are other concepts that develop from the law of the sea, which, by the way, has not been ratified by the United States. There's various conventions, but there's one particular convention which the United States has always refused to ratify. But ultimately, when a ship is sailing on the high seas, which is by far the greatest body of ocean. Well, it's problematic whether it can be interfered with. Just saying. So, yes, there will be supply disruptions after March, probably. But then, within probably just a few weeks, the situation will settle and we'll see that things on the global oil markets will revert to being very much where they were. In the meantime, oil prices have grown, and it remains remarkable to me that there continues to be such extraordinary denial about the cause. Now, there's a long article in yesterday's Times about the fact that oil prices are growing and the fact that this is adding to inflation fears. I should stress this is the London Times. And the title of the article is Oil Price Rise Adds to Inflation Fears Amid Market Turmoil. And then we go on to read, oil prices rose sharply on Monday to their highest level since August, exacerbating concerns over inflation and interest rates that have fueled a sell-off in government bonds. This is British government bonds, since the start of the year. And then we're told that the price of a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude, the international benchmark, rose by 2.87%, or $2.20, to $78.77. The cost of a barrel of Brent crude rose by 1.72%, or $1.37, to $81.13. It's up $4.85, or 6.4% over the last three sessions. And then the whole article discusses at length the inflationary consequences of this, the pressure this is putting on on sterling, the increases of the dollar, the problems of the euro, and all of this. But the most amazing thing about this article is that though it talks about the sudden surge in oil prices this week, yesterday, it doesn't mention the proximate cause. You can go through the entire article and you will find nowhere in it, anywhere, any reference to the fact that the Biden administration has just imposed further sanctions targeting the oil export trade of one of the world's biggest exporters of oil and the world's third biggest producer of oil, which is, of course, Russia. You find it nowhere in the article. It is very bizarre, and it is a further example of how there is total denial across the West. In fact, not denial, there is, I would go further, there is suppression of any coherent discussion about the effect of these attempts to choke the Russian oil trade on Western economies. And this is leading to all sorts of bizarre outcomes. Yesterday, there was a statement published by various Baltic countries, Sweden and Finland, which have from once upon a time being neutral countries, now become compulsive, obsessively hostile countries towards Russia. The three Baltic states, obviously, I believe some others as well, demanding that oil export restrictions on Russia be tightened still. That the oil price cap on the trading of Russian oil, currently $60 a barrel, which was announced by the G7 way back in the winter of 2022-2023, I seem to remember, and which has proved completely ineffectual, or was it 2023-2024, I don't remember, which has proved completely ineffectual. That the oil price cap, the administration of the oil price cap be tightened, though they don't explain how, and that the oil price cap be reduced from $60 a barrel to some even lower price. Never mind that the market is ignoring this cap anyway. They want the cap enforced even further and reduced even further. Whether they will achieve that, of course, I mean, it's hardly likely. I cannot imagine that Donald Trump seriously intends to go down this road. He must know they're trying to do that. Forcing Russian oil off the global markets is only going to create more inflation in the United States, which is going to cause a political problem for him. So I doubt that this is what he will want to do. And unless the United States signs up to this, needless to say, it cannot happen. But the justification that these countries gave for this demand was that, taking a cue from what Biden and the administration were saying on Friday when they announced the latest series of oil sanctions, the situation in the oil markets, the energy markets, is less tight than it was. So therefore, there's more oil around. So therefore, this is a good moment to tighten up further restrictions on Russia. Energy situation is not as they imagine. One of the reasons why it was so tight before in 2022 was precisely because of the sanctions on Russia, which were then imposed. Tightening up the sanctions is inevitably going to tighten up the market. It is going to increase prices. It is going to leave a whole problem of structural obstacles to the trade in oil, which I've discussed in my previous program. That inevitably is going to lead to higher inflation, and that, of course, is going to hit Western industrial and private consumers. It is incredible to me how we just go round and round debating the same things, and have been doing so ever since the sanctions war on Russia began, not in 2022, but in 2014. Whenever sanctions fail, which they invariably have done, the response from the West is, let's introduce still more. Ignore the fact that this is hurting us more than it is hurting the Russians. And by the way, I should say that, of course, as the market tightens, the price of oil rises. And since the Russians will continue to be exporting oil, that will work probably to their advantage. In 2022, they earned more from oil sales than they had done in previous years, because despite the attempts to restrict their exports of oil through sanctions, the oil price rose faster than the effect of the sanctions had on their oil export trade. Anyway, put all that aside. Ignore all of that. Ignore the effect on Western consumers. Ignore the effect on Western industries, on Western businesses, on Western, on people in the West who are struggling with their everyday lives. Just go on piling demands for more and more sanctions. Feed yourself stories that the Russian economy is about to crack, that it's overheating problems, which we know about because the Russian government is telling us about them, are somehow proof that the sanctions are working. Ignore the steps that the Russian government is actually taking, and the real data from the Russian economy, just ignore all of those things, persist in this obsession with sanctions, which annoys more and more countries. Bear in mind that any increase in the oil price is going to be felt most radically in the global south, where the thresholds, the threshold of pain for consumers is much lower than it still is in the West. Just persist in doing this, lose friends, lose influence, cause more people to doubt the sense of sticking with the dollar and the Western financial system. All of this in order to somehow prolong a policy that has failed. Now, as I said, there's that famous expression that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a symptom of insanity. Well, I wouldn't say that in general terms, but in terms of the oil industry, or at least of the sanctions industry, the way the West has approached the whole issue of sanctions with Russia, I'm afraid that is exactly true. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are. I hope, again, that when Trump meets Putin, Trump, who is, after all, a businessman, who is more understanding of the realities of the economic world, who does understand how goods are traded and how markets function. After all, he's lived inside them in ways that none of these decision makers and policy makers who've been making these eccentric decisions do. I hope that he understands that this is simply a fool's strategy and needs to be abandoned. And I hope when he does finally meet with Putin, as I said, he will come away perhaps not with a plan, but with a more realistic understanding of how strong Putin's position is and how proportionately less strong his position is, Trump's position is, if he really does want to try and push the Russians into some kind of negotiation to end the war, not on their terms, but on the West's. It's not going to happen. Now, on that, perhaps I would just also focus instead, once again, on perhaps the most single important point that Trump made in these comments. He accepts that it is Putin who is going to make the ultimate decisions about the war. There's only one strategy, and it's up to Putin. So it's for Putin to make the decision. I'm not sure how far Trump has understood all of these points that I've made, whether he really understands the true nature of the situation on the battlefront, whether he understands the real state of the Russian economy, whether he understands the true realities of the global oil trade and shipping trade and all of that. But he has been involved in negotiations. He is interested in diplomacy. And as I've said before, unless one is somebody who is completely obtuse in the way that, say, the current US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is, unless one is completely obtuse, the best way of gauging the strength of one's own position and the strength of the other side is by meeting them. And that's another reason why a summit meeting between Putin and Trump in relation to the situation in Ukraine can only be a good thing. Now, I discussed at length how people are in denial about the realities of the situation with sanctions, how an entire article in the London Times can be published discussing the rise in oil prices without mentioning the proximate cause for that rise, which is the oil sanctions, the sanctions on the Russian oil industry just issued by the Biden administration. But of course, the same is equally true about the situation on the battlefronts. There is today, for example, a really very astonishing article by Tim Collins in the Daily Telegraph. Tim Collins, by my recollection, former British military officer. And it reads that Putin is running out of men to stuff into the meat grinder. Korean drone bait can't save him. And the basic story of the article is that Russian losses are so high that the Russians are running out of men, and that's why the Koreans have had to be recruited to fill up the gaps. The most extraordinary fact about this article is that there isn't a single shred of evidence anywhere effectively confirming any of this hypothesis. Just as the article in the London Times can talk about the rise of oil prices without mentioning the sanctions, so this article in the Daily Telegraph talks about Russian troop shortages without in any way addressing any of the realities of the war. One of the reasons why I go to so much trouble to inform myself about the actual events in the war, even tedious and sometimes upsetting though that is, spending hours of time trying to work out what's going on in Chasov Yar, for example, is because unless one has that granular understanding of the conflict, one is going to get it wrong. By the way, that is true of almost everything. Just saying, in order to get proper mastery of any topic, one is obliged, in my experience, to go into the granular detail. Impressions are always misleading. And when those impressions, as in the case of Tim Collins' piece, are informed by wishful thinking, they are straightforwardly disastrous. But anyway, there we are. Well, we shall see, as I said, what happens next. In my opinion, the Biden administration, as I've said already, has now shot its last bolt. The oil sanctions were the last big attempt to move the dial on the Russian economy. The fact that they create trouble for Donald Trump, made the temptation to impose them apparently irresistible. The missile strikes on Russia, it's the same, and we see that they're failing. The Russians continue to advance. It's now all up to Donald Trump. He's made it clear that he wants a meeting with Putin. He wants that meeting to happen very quickly. There will be some kind of a discussion sometime in the next couple of days, and I expect that shortly after the inauguration, agreement will finally be reached on a proper summit meeting. All sorts of countries are now queuing up to host the summit meeting. Slovakia was the first, Switzerland was the second. As I said in my program yesterday, I cannot imagine that the Swiss will agree to this, to host, as rather the Russians will agree to Switzerland hosting the summit, not after all that has happened. But anyway, that offer from Switzerland has been made. Serbia is a third. We'll see where it happens. My guess is that it will be somewhere in the Middle East. Maybe in Egypt, perhaps in Turkey, that there are reasons to think that relations between the United States and Turkey are going to come under further strain. I'm going to come to that shortly. Who knows? But Egypt is a possibility. Maybe Saudi Arabia. Who's to say? One of the Gulf states um, um, Dubai, Doha. In one of these places, we might see a summit meeting. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, there we go. Now, before I do turn quickly and briefly to the situation in the Middle East and the Caucasus, let me say that even though there is this wall of denial across the West about many of the realities on the Ukrainian battlefronts, the realities about the sanctions, there is one politician who is making waves by actually saying things as they are. And I have to say that is Alice Weidel in Germany, who is, of course, the candidate for the AfD. She's made a whole series of extraordinary statements over the last couple of days, especially at the AfD conference, where the AfD refused apparently to criticize Russia. Anyway, she said that Nord Stream should be put back into service. She talked about the catastrophic effects of the cutoff in gas supplies to Germany. She's also talked about apparently doing away with the windmills that have been placed all over Germany, which she has described as a disgrace. Well, many people will have different views about the windmills, and I'm not going to go into that territory. But here at least we see a politician who is taking the economic consequences of the sanctions head on, who's talking openly and truthfully about what they mean. And this is happening in a German election. I don't know how this is going to play out in Germany. Germany remains a country deeply anchored in the West, and of course the political class in Germany will regard these statements as anathema, and they so regard the entire AfD. I noticed, by the way, and just to quickly add, that the BSW and Sarah Wagenknecht are now saying exactly the same things. In some respects, I understand. They're even going rather further than Alice Weidel has done. Though realistically, the only person who's likely to break through in a big way in this election is going to be Weidel and the AfD. The BSW has not been around long enough to have organized properly for an election at this time. Just to say. Of course, if you look outside the big states, Germany, France, Britain, Italy, some of the smaller countries, you do find leaders who also say things as they are. Robert Fico has been increasingly outspoken, for example. He's increasingly criticizing the Ukrainians. He's saying that Zelensky spends his time blackmailing Europe with energy issues, whilst at the same time scrounging for money. I understand his language was even stronger than I have just said, but you get a flavour of what Fico is saying. I understand that the Hungarians are also being equally outspoken. But in terms of this code of silence that we have seen in Europe, the fact that a politician of a major party, because the AfD in Germany now is a major party, is talking in the way that Alice Weidel is doing, could be seen as essentially as almost a revolutionary act. Now let's turn to the situation in the Middle East. And I think it's now becoming increasingly clear that we are indeed heading towards some kind of a showdown between Turkey and Israel and the United States. I say that because the rhetoric from Turkey is becoming stronger, even as Israel's problems, it is clear, have not been solved by the collapse of the Assad government in Syria. There's now been a report in the Wall Street Journal which confirms the reports, or rather, presumably is based on the same reports I've been reading in the Israeli media, that far from having been defeated, Hamas in Gaza is busy reconstituting itself. It regularly recaptures streets in Gaza, which the Israelis tell themselves that they have captured. And it has reconstituted its leadership around Mohammed Sinwar, who is the brother of the Sinwar who orchestrated the events of 7th October and who the Israeli forces recently killed. So it doesn't look as if the situation in Gaza has turned out well for Israel. And though there is now some reason to think that a ceasefire in Gaza is now imminent, with a release of the hostages and a release of some Palestinian prisoners, the major Israeli objective, which was the destruction of Hamas in Gaza, has not been achieved. Now, any ceasefire that we see in Gaza in which Hamas survives is a victory for Hamas. And this is a point I have made in program after program. The kind of ceasefire that is now apparently on the brink of being achieved is one which, in my opinion, could have been achieved a year ago, or at any point over the last year. Certainly Hamas has had to make significant concessions. But for them, the most important thing, as for any group like them, is to preserve themselves. And that is what they have achieved. So, this ceasefire, or something very like it, could have been achieved at any time over the last year. The fact that it is about to be on the brink of being achieved now, apparently because Donald Trump wants a ceasefire in place before he becomes president, and has made that absolutely clear to Netanyahu in the various contacts that have taken place between the two. The fact that a ceasefire like that is happening now, after a whole year, is a tragedy. A tragedy which has led to the deaths of tens of thousands. And there's a report in the Lancet which is saying that some of the estimates we've been hearing about deaths, civilian deaths in Gaza, might be an underestimate. And there's another article by Seymour Hersh in which he has been giving descriptions of the way in which some IDF soldiers have been behaving in Gaza, which, if true, I have to say I found very disturbing. Anyway, this whole affair is ending in a debacle. And I'm going to suggest that the same is true about Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are reports that Iran has been able to resume supplies to Lebanon, and that, to Hezbollah, and that it is able to do so through Turkish-controlled territory. And given how bad the relationship between Turkey and Israel is now becoming, that, I have to say, does not surprise me. So, there we are. A negotiation, a settlement achieved, long overdue. Hamas is still there. Israel's reputation hugely damaged. Weaknesses in the IDF exposed. Further radicalization of opinion inside Israel itself. And the Israeli economy has been dealt a heavy hit. It looks as if also the plan to launch a strike against Iran, as I discussed in a recent program, has also been called off. If all this is true, if we do get this negotiation, then, and a ceasefire, then this will have been a tragic exercise in futility. And of course, many others will use far stronger words. And of course, we have ongoing cases in The Hague, which could take the process further and lead to all kinds of judicial decisions, which will be dreadful in their political consequences for Israel, and which will embarrass the Trump administration and Israel's supporters, and who knows, might lead even further to other things. Again, as you will have realized, I'm picking my words very carefully. A diplomatic response to the Hamas attack back on the 7th of October, of the sort that we have discussed many times on the Duran, and which I have discussed on these programs, would have led to a very different outcome. But I'm not going to go over that now. Lastly, in the Caucasus, we have now had an incredibly belligerent interview by the Azerbaijani President Aliyev, in which he has spoken in extremely strong terms about Armenia, and appears to be giving very heavy hints that Azerbaijan is planning some other big military operation against Armenia. If that does happen, and I'm not certain that it will, then we will see a further case study of how being America's enemy is dangerous, but being America's friend can sometimes be fatal. Because what has been steadily happening ever since the current Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, took office, is that Armenia has been changing alliances. It has shifted from its long-standing historic alliance with Russia, which could and did protect Armenia, towards new relationships with the United States and with the Western powers, especially France, which, by the way, appear to have infuriated both Aliyev and Erdogan, Armenia's deadly enemies. And of course, what we're starting to see is that France and the United States are not in any position to project power into this part of the Caucasus and to help Armenia if it finds itself in trouble. So, Armenia, having distanced itself from its Russian ally, given good cause to for the Russian ally to doubt that there is even an alliance in existence between these two countries, Armenia and Russia, anymore. Well, it's now possible that something which, say, 5 years ago, I would have said was impossible, that an attack on Armenia might come from Azerbaijan and Turkey, and Russia would not step in to save Armenia. That situation could now be upon us. I desperately hope that that doesn't happen, that Aliyev's words are bluff, but we can see how this disastrous foreign policy that Pashinyan and his officials have followed, which has already lost Nagorno-Karabakh, Artash, as I believe the Armenians call it, how that is now putting Armenia itself in jeopardy. Whether Pashinyan and the others understand this, whether they're able to change course, is another matter. The course that they have followed is both a provocation to Aliyev and a temptation. Aliyev has respect for the Russians. He has none for the French, just saying. We'll see what comes. all of this fills me with concern and foreboding. But, well, I still want to hope that the worst can be avoided. If so, it will not be thanks to Pashinyan. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to go to our shop. If you've liked this video, please tick the like button. And don't forget also to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More for me soon. Have a very good day.